another episode of Cyber from the Front Lines. Today, we are going to talk about threat hunting and especially how to hunt for TTPs associated with BlackSuit. And to walk us through this, I'm pleased to welcome Scott Poley, Senior Threat Hunter at Intel 471, formerly Cyborg. It's great to have you on this podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I remember I listened to your pitch, I think at FSISAC a couple of years back. I think it was at Orlando, and that was the first time I heard about Cyborg. You had given that pitch there. Pretty awesome, pretty amazing. And that was
You're talking about the Tempt the Titans one?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. Nice.
It's very nerve-wracking.
Yeah, especially in 5 minutes, you had to walk everybody through all of that stuff. That was really amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I'm sure a lot of us got hitched to Cyborg after that because I hadn't heard about Cyborg before that. So it was pretty cool. So let's begin with from your journey. How did you start in cybersecurity, and how did you transition into threat hunting?
Yeah, so kind of my backstory. I would try to do the traditional path where I finished school, went off to college, thought I was going to study engineering actually. And then I kind of just didn't find the right path in school. Kind of lost a lot of interest in what there was going on there. So I kind of jumped in and went to the military track. I figured I didn't know what I was doing. It would give me some skills, some experience, and some more time to figure things out. And I ended up, fortunately, following some people to go more of the special operations route. So I learned a lot about Intel because of that. Now, granted, it wasn't anything to do with cyber operations or anything like that, but I was really involved in a lot of technology, though, because I was like a communications specialist. So from radios to networking equipment to servers, computers, just pretty much anything to support the effort for some of the really cool missions we were doing. And obviously, there's a lot of security wrapped around that because everything was very classified and how we handled information and things. So I kind of learned a lot about just security in general from that avenue as well. And when I got out, I thought, well, I really want to dive into forensics was kind of becoming a thing, like computer forensics and the software side. So I did get my computer science degree at Eastern Kentucky University. And because we had to get certifications to maintain certain access on government networks, I already had a lot of certifications that allowed me to become the intern and then eventually lead the security group at the university while finishing school. So I kind of got a sink or swim experience because it was, from policy writing to monitoring the network to doing investigations and DMCA things because students and people download things illegally and have to like track those down. So I got to kind of just jump in and try a bunch of things as kind of a lone wolf. And then when I graduated, I had an opportunity to actually go to a security operation. It took me up to Ohio, where I am currently. And I got hired on as an analyst, and it was a new security operations center that was getting built. And I eventually promoted myself up to running the security operations center. But I remember the journey from, we had all this data and all these things we managed to pull things in, and we were so self-reliant on alerting. I kind of felt like, God, we got to be missing something, right? Like, if I'm just waiting for alerts or the only thing I interact with are alerts, then, what do I do when there's no alerts? Or what if the alerts aren't telling me anything interesting? So I went to an interesting, I forgot what conference it was, but there was an interesting individual. His name was Michael Morris. I don't know if you've ever heard of Route 9B.
No.
So I hadn't either, but they offered a training session then, and they had since gotten acquired by Deloitte. But the services they offered, which I hadn't quite heard before, was threat hunting, but it was threat hunting as a service. It wasn't so they did a lot of things where companies, when the acquisitions occurred, they would threat hunt on the acquired entity to see if they're already compromised. So you're not joining a network that's compromised to your network and things like that, and did some other things. And so they all originated, a lot of them, from kind of previous NSA talent,
Mm.
where threat hunting is a very common practice because government is kind of dealing with those persistent threats. So they're trying to figure out how do they get the slow and quiet adversaries, like where do they sit, how do they discover them. And he kind of walked through some training I went at this conference, and he basically was saying, like, here's the introduction to interpreter and those common attack tools. And he was saying these are cool, but this is also at a very large scale, they don't work very well. And then he started describing, well, I can just use what's already on the systems with like configuring ways for NetSH to already forward traffic for me on a Windows system, or doing all these native utilities, kind of like the lull bins we're used to today.
Right.
But it was the first time I've really heard about that. And he just demonstrated it and it made it look really easy. And I was thinking, gosh, well, a lot of the security tools that we utilize, at that time, especially, were signature based. So we're looking for things that were known. And if they were unknown, they kind of went off reputation,
Mhm.
or if they're signed, right? And but if adversaries are using things that already exist that are a common utility, then a lot of those defenses that rely on a lot of those types of methods pretty much will go undetected. And so because of that tie and that training, I reached out to them to see what kind of training they had, because at that point I was a leader in the SOC, and kind of how can I expose my guys to that methodology. Um, and so we did kind of it was a CTI driven course, but they kind of drove in threat intelligence to how do you apply threat intelligence and do threat hunting, and what does threat hunting really look like. And they had some really good training too, with just like looking at data in swaths. Like, it's interesting when you just look at alerts, you look at a very small amount of your data, right? And the example they did, is a pretty common practice I've heard now, but at the time it just kind of dawned on me as genius. But they basically looked at this proxy data for all the web traffic, and they just took the Alexa top million and said, let's just filter out what are most common and popular, and then study what's left. And I was like, man, there's just so many ways when you start grouping large amounts of data to start finding what's rare. So there wasn't so much hypothesis driven hunting at that point. It was more just, hey, you have all this data. How are different ways you can utilize it? And so when I was referencing earlier about how, when I was an analyst, I sat there and waited for alerts or only interacted with alerts. It kind of left me with things not to do, or I didn't really grow or learn the environment very well. But now I had like new tools and approaches to how can I take on a large environment, look at a bunch of different data, kind of break it up in segments and groupings, to get a better understanding of things, and maybe even identify some interesting things to start investigating further. Um, so that kind of, started that journey with that threat hunting methodology. And then we kind of started building in, as we started learning some of the techniques, and MITRE kind of came out around that time too. So that was a great classification for not just looking for IOCs. Let's think about how actors behave. And then I eventually left where I was at and joined Cyborg, which primarily focuses on just threat hunting, hypothesis driven, and building those hunts and content, and then figuring out different ways to use different tooling. So that was the one thing, when you work in an organization, sometimes you only put your hands on a couple tools. What was really interesting about working at Cyborg, because we search so many or support so many different tool sets, one, we can see the visibility a lot of tool sets have. And it was very clear that just because a tool set was a really good tool set didn't mean, one, that it would detect an alert on things. Because some behaviors, if you were to alert on the behavior itself, there'd be too much noise, because normal administrative tasks use these behaviors, or users in general might use these behaviors. So you got to kind of figure out how to make the maliciousness stand out. But also sometimes they're just not telemetry for those behaviors at all in certain tools. And, it was a very clear indication that, yeah, maybe threat hunting is very applicable, because it allows you to use the data you already have better, use the tools you have better. That proactive approach makes more sense. And then, as we built content for, 3 years, I was at Cyborg before we got acquired.
Mhm.
Um, we started learning that, hey, when we need to build new things, we weren't building things at the same pace on the third year as we were the first year because the behaviors were still being utilized, and all we had to do was take Intel and re-enrich
Right.
older packages, right? Make them more applicable, or add more insights to them so that people realize how relevant they may be still. Which kind of validated that as well as like, oh, this is actually a thing that is actually effective.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my journey of kind of what brought me the whole threat hunting um, from start to finish, I guess. Yeah.
It's really good. And I think a lot of folks from military have a very smooth transition into cyber. I had a similar conversation with Lee as well, and he had a similar
hmm I
journey.
was actually his team lead when we were in the military, so we were very close. Yeah.
Yeah, he mentioned that, so that's awesome. And to your point, yeah, I also uh, got into threat hunting like a couple of years, like 2, 3 years back, and I realized, for example, when I look at threat hunting or ransomware group or ransomware TTPs, you know, when I do that delta analysis on using MITRE, there's a
hmm
common techniques all these threat actors are using. So it's just a matter of enriching. That's what I observed as well.
Yeah.
Uh, so let's talk about threat hunting itself. There's a lot of some people have different ideas about threat hunting. Some
Yeah.
say that it's oh we are threat hunting, and when I talk to them, I say oh okay it was more like IOC search and not exactly threat hunting. So if you could just walk us through what exactly is threat hunting, how do you see it?
So, I know the definition we commonly use, and I'll kind of speak to that first, and then I'll kind of walk through how I look at the approach of threat hunting. But the common definition that we kind of stick by, which I think goes back to its origins when I mentioned earlier, like the NSA has been doing threat hunting for a long time within government environments. But it's that proactive approach where you're looking for behaviors, TTPs, not IOCs. Um, and it's a human driven thing. It's not so much a machine enabled thing that would handle it for you. So, and there's some caveats to that. So some of the things that technology that you can put in technology and it can automatically do, I wouldn't call it threat hunting. And that's why IOCs, I think, fall off the table for that, because you can drop IOCs in a lot of common tools today and they can automatically search back for you.
Yeah.
So there's not really a craft associated with it. And it's something that should be something you can easily automate too at some point, right? Um, but when you look at behaviors, one of the things that when we looked at high priority targets in the military, we had to study patterns of behavior for people in the world, right? How they operated, how they moved, to create key points on if we needed to go capture a target, we knew where they'd likely be and what they'd likely be doing. And that's kind of the same methodology when you look at people using a system or a computer. Um, is what are they likely to do based on what they're trying to achieve? And I think in our space, sometimes it feels daunting on what an adversary can do, but there's a lot of pretty strong guardrails as far as how someone can manipulate and move across a network. And that's what's really interesting when you look at behaviors that when we say threat hunt for, they overlap a lot. Like for instance, there's only a handful of ways things can be executed, and there's always some unique things some people find on how to execute, but sometimes they tie to persistence and things like that, um, or how you can authenticate or how you can steal credentials. There's a finite number of those. Like you look at MITRE, like I think the last time I looked at the MITRE count for techniques is around 410, I think, techniques. Um, and when you look at the number of IOCs, like that number is astronomically larger, right?
Right.
So when you think about trying to deal with the problem of security, and when we talk about 410 techniques, you're probably not going to count the ones on the reconnaissance side as much, right? So that list even gets smaller, and then you don't really want to be hunting for things like right when they happen, like, oh, it was X filled, so we lost data, but we identified it. That's good, but you kind of really want to focus kind of the middle of the MITRE framework um, to get the kind of the biggest gains. And so that now that number is even smaller for where you're actually focusing. And then what you're really relying on from a threat hunting perspective is how have adversaries behaved in the past? What are some common things they're doing? Can I look for that in a repeated fashion? And yes, there's going to be noise built in because, one of the things adversaries have learned a while ago was if they use the same tools that everyone else uses on a network, it's a lot harder to be identified because it's not just something that glaringly stands out. Now, granted, experience makes that a little easier. Like if I see some sort of PowerShell code or something like that, most of the time I could say, yeah, that looks like an administrative task versus no, that looks like bad just because of how it's, delivered or what it looks like from like obfuscation and things like that that a lot of attackers use. Um, but yeah, it is kind of a craft, and I do think that one unique thing about threat hunting is your experience plays a lot into how you threat hunt because not everyone has the same knowledge set, right? So there's some people that when they say threat hunting, they're like, yeah, I look at network stuff and only network data. Well, that's really good to look at. And there's a lot of good things you can find there, but there's some people that are better at endpoint. There's some people that are better looking at specific data sets when it comes to databases because they understand that because maybe their past life, they're a database admin. So, that's something that I think makes threat hunting also kind of unique, and you have very strong skill sets, but they might be very niche as far as where people fall and what people do.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a pretty good example of what the differentiation is between threat hunting and the other mutual indicator search. So moving on to the latest threat that we all are seeing in the news, BlackSuit ransomware gang. Uh, if you could take us through this use case and how would you take this threat and break it down to hunt for TTPs associated with
Yeah, so I can kind of walk through. We put together a collection of things that we built, right? And I'll kind of touch on what those are and why they're significant, but also kind of a backstory too. Um, so BlackSuit, what's interesting when we talk about, I always feel bad when I say ransomware is like the lowest common denominator threat hunter, or not threat hunter, but adversary. It's not that they're not sophisticated. It's just they don't utilize a lot of techniques that are groundbreaking or something no one's ever seen before. The only thing that ransomware actors typically use that are new or maybe new phishing techniques, or if a new vulnerability comes out, they might, use or exploit a new vulnerability. But that's really getting in the door stuff that, threat hunters usually focus on post exploitation, right? So something's already in your environment. How would you find it at that point? Because the perimeter didn't stop it or your controls didn't stop it. So they kind of operate very similarly. And BlackSuit's interesting in this aspect because one of the main leaders for BlackSuit was actually a main leader for the Conti ransomware group. So when we talk about how these ransomware groups operate, well, it's because there's a lot of lineage that kind of ties to other ransomware groups. And actually, so the main leader of BlackSuit came from Conti, but the ransomware that primarily was used in the group was really previously Royal ransomware. And one of the reasons why they changed names was to try to throw off law enforcement. So now you kind of have, the obvious ties that what we may have been defending in the past is going to be similar to what we're defending in the present, right? So those are always really interesting. And, we even see, with our new intel insights that we have to the underground being part of Intel 471 about, how are they recruiting people? What are their targets when it comes to what systems and things do they care about? Like the BlackSuit group put out, they're really interested in ESXi, Linux and Windows, which are pretty common in general across ransomware groups. But it was interesting too, they even threw out like, what are some of the common uses of BlackSuit ransomware and what arguments can you do when you run it? And so those insights, I think, help us threat hunt better, more proactively. And that's where the intel flowing into some of the stuff we do works really well. But from some of the collections, one of the things that BlackSuit's known for doing, and especially the recent stuff. The BCD edit. It's a command line utility for managing the boot configuration. A lot of people use that to get rid of any kind of recovery methods because ransomware commonly will try to disable any way to recover before it does the ransom because otherwise the ransom's not as effective or the encryption. So that's a common technique. The one thing I like about the BCD edit stuff is it seems to be more of not as automatically built in as like the VS admin or VSS admin where it deletes shadow copies. That kind of seems to be built into a lot of the malware where it executes it. So it's more closer to the end when the encryption occurs. And then one of the things that's interesting is there's a lot of PS exec execution that happens, right? A lot of people use that as administrators, but adversaries use that a lot too because of the system level privileges that you can gain very easily. But the one unique thing about sysinternal tools in general is they're always setting a EULA, where you have to accept the use of using the tool. And if you're running it from the command line, you can auto accept that, but it writes things to the registry that says that EULA has been accepted, so you're not constantly being prompted when you're using the tool sets. And because they use this mechanism, that's something that widespread when they're doing lateral type things or moving things and they're using PS exec. If you're even looking at that registry keys where those EULAs exist, then you would know that there's something weird going on, especially in mass, right? And that's what I think is cool about when we're hunting in general. We're always trying to aggregate data to simplify things and group things together. And so obviously if we saw, if we were looking at that registry key in this case, if we saw one instance of it, it might not be as alarming, but all of a sudden you see a group of 30 and you're like, well, why did 30 all of a sudden, persist internal tools were used in this last 5 minutes?
Right.
That's interesting, right? That means something is going on that it just happened around the same time. And then part of that sysinternal tools, if you're not monitoring that registry key, one of the things that they typically use that for is copying their payloads and other tools laterally across networks. And they typically will hit the admin share on devices if it's available, which shows up as $.
Mhm.
But we've seen a lot of times too where they've just copied in some reporting just to hidden shares in general. And so any hidden folder in Windows ends with the $. So just looking for hidden shares in that copy technique with hidden shares as part of that, now you can get the admin share they commonly use. And if there's other hidden shares, they either stand up or hidden shares they try to target. That was another thing that we looked for when looking at some of their behaviors. And then one of the things that I think a lot of adversaries do, especially when they're trying to move laterally in the network, especially BlackSuit, they were utilizing WMI. And WMI is a really effective way in an environment to do a number of things because visibility is not as keen for WMI in a lot of environments. A PowerShell seems to be easier to use and sometimes more powerful. So a lot of adversaries will prefer that. I even remember when we had a pen test done to us when I was in the security operations, we were all over the pen testers because they use PowerShell. And once they realized, based on having visibility to some of the chats we're having with some of the users, because there were users that were using PowerShell that didn't make sense. So we're kind of like, hey, were you using PowerShell? They saw those conversations and then immediately switched to using WMI because they knew we had visibility to PowerShell. And then it kind of went dark for us. We had to figure out how to solve that problem. But yeah, so they use that remote call process call, which is common arguments with WMI. That you'll see those patterns very easily from the command line. And that's a really effective way to either once you move a payload, like I talked about before, you can create a process remotely with WMI. And if you're calling some sort of payload that will talk back or do any kind of that remote connections, that's kind of where you see a lot of that. The other thing they like to do, which is pretty common these days because it's pretty quick too, but Kerber roasting.
Mm. Yeah.
So they've taken advantage of Kerber roasting. And Kerber roasting is kind of an interesting attack because it kind of is an offline attack in its sense, right? The big thing with Kerber roasting is you're hoping to downgrade the encryption for service accounts for the way the tickets are passed. And so that's pretty easy to see. But the hard part I've seen in working in some environments is legacy applications may not support the higher AES encryption. So you might naturally be using the RC4 encryption in general in some environments. So detecting that might not be as easy. But it's always good that if someone is actually requesting Kerberos tickets from the same source, a lot of them for different accounts in general, that's usually bad. And there's if they're just hitting service accounts, then it's pretty obvious because that's really what a lot of adversaries are leveraging when they do Kerber roasting. So that's a big one. And then it's interesting that this isn't monitored, but they still use for domain credentials when they land on a domain controller. They're doing a lot of NTDS util, which is lets them manage the database of the domain or the directory, and they're dumping the database that way. So that part is interesting that still is successful in some environments because it's a very well-known technique. But it just shows how, what people are monitoring from a detection standpoint versus looking for certain behaviors for some aspects. And the other thing too, even if you were looking at it from a behavior or detection standpoint, if they still have to dump the system hive for that to be effective, because if you're just getting the database from Active Directory, it's still encrypted with a key that's stored in the system hive. So there's really two parts to that attack. And I always like attacks that have multiple parts because there's multiple opportunities for behavior to fall onto. So, and then the last package that we kind of really looked at that is interesting is WinSCP. It's a secure copy right tool. But one of the things that's unique about adversaries using it is a lot of them don't have the graphic user interface access like remote desktop. I know they use a remote desktop a lot and they use some remote management tools. But in some cases where they're not using that, they'll actually use the command line version of WinSCP. So when you start seeing WinSCP on the command line arguments being passed,
Mhm.
that looks suspicious versus if it was launched with a GUI, it wouldn't look the same. And that's just a prime example of a very common tool that nothing is going to flag and detect on WinSCP. It's a known legitimate
Right.
utility.
Yeah.
But if depending on how it's used, the command line versus the typical user using the GUI, very different experiences and very different reasons why you might do that. So, hunting for those behaviors can really stand out for that aspect. So yeah, so it's an interesting group, and obviously they've been kind of successful, but I feel like their success really stems from they've been around a long time, even though they kind of rebrand themselves, right? Um,
Right.
and they do. It's interesting too when you look at the risk perspective. They're targeting. I think they called it tier one on their stuff, but they're targeting tier one groups. Only companies that are worth a million or more. Um, and they actively recruit pen testers and things like that. So you can see job postings on the underground and stuff like that. It's just really interesting to see how they actually operate. It's very much like a business um, aspect as well. So
Oh, yeah, that's more like the Conti playbook. I have
yeah,
to stop here.
yeah, that was I think when that Conti playbook got published, that was one of my first activities at Cyborg was actually digging through all that and trying to line up hunt packages for it.
Yeah, so yeah, it's typical Conti, like you said. Yeah.
The one thing that's interesting, and this is something in our podcast we talk about every time we come up with a report. We do the Out of the Woods threat hunting podcast, um, and I actually started creating content back when the Conti release happened. But when we talk about human nature as far as attackers go, um, the the reason why adversaries do it, I don't know, but the single character file names and single character executables, single character scripts, um, stands out like a sore thumb, and everybody does it from an attacker perspective. It seems like we pull almost a report a week where an attacker is used, like they name their script one dot ps1 or a dot exe, um, And that was all over the Conti manuals. We mentioned that. Yeah, that was like the first thing I noticed was like, well, they're just really lazy. And I wonder if we can capitalize on that, right? So just even things like that from a behavior standpoint, if you're not talking just techniques, just like human habit, are good things to pick up on.
Oh, yeah. So just digging back on this discussion, once we do the threat hunt, I was wondering what would be the possible post-hunt outcomes? Either you find an incident, or if not an incident, there's definitely a detection opportunity. Do you see anything else? Because there's a lot of, from a management perspective,
Hmm.
people always ask about, okay, this is great, you did so, this is really good, but what was the outcome of all this?
Right. So, there's really four buckets we put a lot of our main hunts in.
Mhm.
But there's a lot more value that can be added to that as well. So typically, like you mentioned, if we find bad, that's the obvious one, right? So we successfully found something that we had an incident and we responded to it. That's a good find and shows some value right away. The detection opportunity is also a really good one because, like we mentioned before, there's some things you may hunt for, and my bias when it comes to threat hunting is I feel like threat hunting should be the precursor to detection engineering. So everything should start almost like a hunt because you really learn a lot about your environment and might do different hunts and kind of give you ideas for different things to look for, but then you can then promote things through detection engineering that way.
Mhm.
But yeah, you might hunt for things that you might see, hey, we didn't see any activity in our environment, but it's really good to validate your visibility so that you know that you're not seeing things because they're not happening, not because you don't actually have the data. Um, and once that's validated and you don't have a lot of activity, those can go right to detections like we talked. And those are really good because you're maturing your security operation, right? You're giving yourself like a leg up essentially by doing that. Um, and then, visibility gaps, like I mentioned, that's also a good find from a maturity standpoint because if you're hunting for something and you're able to try to emulate some of the behaviors you're trying to find, um, then you can validate, do we have the right visibility or telemetry? Um, and is it something that you can make a change for, today, through how your configurations are in your environment or, how the tools are set up? Or are you highlighting a bigger problem in your environment that now from a strategy perspective, are there other, because, sometimes I've been in this situation before as leadership and security where budget's available and all of a sudden you're like, well, what do we need? And you're kind of like, I don't know what we need, but more is better. So you kind of come up with something, and sometimes it's the shiny object that kind of gets the purchase kind of thing. But it's nice to have a good understanding on what kind of control you have in your environment as far as visibility and where your detections and things and responses sit. And threat hunting helps with that conversation because you can sit there and say, yeah, we do really well over here. We struggle in this area. And oh, we have no visibility and we can't do anything about it unless we get a new tool. And that's a much better conversation to have a leadership when you need to adjust your strategy or make a spend than just saying, yeah, we want that because we hear it's good and it's going to help right now. Be able to really define those things and have that conversation specifically around your environment, not just on tools capabilities, is really good to have. Um, and then there's just the no outcome. Like for instance, you run a hunt and you might say, yes, we see activity. None of it lines up with malicious activity, right? But you walk away with a couple things with that. One, you have a good understanding of your environment, right? Like if you're looking for a specific behavior, you can maybe identify, oh, this behavior seems to fall in HR or some project team that whatever they do here, or an IT project or a change that was going on. So you can kind of understand when you do see that behavior, how you can respond to that data faster, or maybe weed certain things out to make or refine the hunt for future cases where you run that. But the other thing that I think this is where threat intelligence really comes into play to start adding value is, we spend a lot of time mapping, like when I talked about we'd have a threat hunt and we'll go back as we get new threat intel and we'll add more metadata about, oh, this behavior is being used by this group now, and this behavior is now kind of being used as a different technique, so it almost covers down on multiple MITRE techniques because of how it's being utilized. that's also a really good conversation when there's no outcome to say, yeah, we might not have seen this, but it's not us covering down on one technique or this one behavior. We're covering down on these 5 to 10 adversaries with this one technique, and we're covering down on a few different MITRE or malware samples or malware families based on this technique. So you're basically seeing that one to many relationship from that single effort, and that really helps capitalize on what the efforts of threat hunting can offer. Because like I said, there's only so many techniques. When we talked about there's 410 MITRE and you're actually doing a smaller SKU than that, when you cover down on what is there that you can cover down on, and it's one to many from a relationship as far as what you're defending against, it seems like a more solvable problem, and you can see the value from a small to large scale. So I think being able to use your threat intelligence that way to enrich your threat hunts is a really valuable tool, and that's something we actively are trying to build into our packages at Cyborg or Intel 471, but the Cyborg Hunter platform. And there's more to come there. Some exciting things we're trying to do and test out. So we definitely see the value there, and our customers have given us good feedback so far.
Really awesome. Especially two things that you mentioned. One was mapping techniques to the hunts and different adversaries. That's actually a very, very good way to show the value from a hunting perspective as well. Nice. So finally, I had another question for you. The last one is automation. Everybody talks about automation, and I know, and like hunting is more human driven.
Right.
We automate so much. So wanted to know what phases of threat hunting do you think we can really automate and what we cannot?
Yeah, so I kind of have a strategy when it comes to automation and threat hunting. So I think one of the core problems when people talk about automation when it comes to security operations and IT in general is it's the common perspective that when you automate something, you kind of solve it and it's hands off, right? But automation adds many different layers to problem solving. And sometimes it's not about solving the problem from start to finish, but it might be enhancing the solution or enhancing your efforts or reducing some efforts, right? And that's kind of, I feel like, how automation plays a role potentially. So, I kind of looked at automation and threat hunting in like a 4-phased approach. And there's a lot of manual involvement in that. So this is something I'm actually going to talk if the talk gets accepted for FSISAC in Atlanta. I'm going to kind of do a little spiel on this as well. But yeah, so the 4 phases was really the first phase I was going to basically hit up on was to learn and validate, right? And this is where, that manual, I just starting in this hunt, I need to see what it looks like in my environment. I need to know who, what, why when it comes to this behavior. And then once you've done a few cycles on that, then you know that you're in a good place to maybe schedule and run that, right? So that you can basically say, all right, this is in a good place. Now we can run that. But one of the things that I've always wanted to be able to do from an automation perspective is because once you have the data structured, right, you know what columns are going to be returned. You kind of know what data you expect to see in each one of those columns. Is if you're able to take results and you're able to sort them, unique them, and then do diffs on them. Now you have like a set to say, this is something that's been validated from previous hunts. We get a new hunt. We do the same sorting, unique, and diffs on that. Now we can say what's different, right? And immediately you can say, well, there's already things we probably have already validated we don't need to look at. And it's a quicker way where automation can help say, well, let's look at the unique things. It's not like you don't have the full list that you can't look at, but it now becomes a shorter list, right? And over time, it's almost like another way of maturing that. So I feel like once you kind of get a good grasp on that approach, then you start running into what I call applying different data SKUs. And I've talked about like grouping data and looking at data differently. So I've done some talks on when you hunt, you might aggregate the data differently and you might get different results. A good example is, if you're going to aggregate based on what hosts exhibit this behavior versus what users are running this behavior versus what parent processes are associated with this behavior. And you're doing this grouping by those key components. Different things will show up on number of occurrences. Different things will kind of float to the top. And so I think once you kind of get some of those scheduling and those different SKUs going on, you kind of will get an idea on what SKU gives you high, medium, and low volumes. And I feel like you can now put those in different buckets, because if something gives a really low volume, that might be something you can automate, create alerts off, so that almost goes to that SOC operation standpoint where we're like, it's not quite a detection, but if it's 5 results,
Right.
that might be something that a SOC analyst would appreciate seeing a little extra data
Mm-hmm.
and then making decisions on. And then medium, if it's like 50 to 100 results or something, now you're like, these are things that we might tackle on a daily basis. And the high volume is based on when you have the time or whatever, right? So you have these 3 different buckets. Now you can manage differently, and you might be able to build other automations and enrichments around those too. And then the 4th bucket was really going to be capturing insights. So I talked about how if you aggregate off of different key components, you might have different results kind of hit the top of the list, right? You'll kind of see similar data, but you have things that kind of filter to the top. Well, what would be interesting is what if you have overlapping data between those different data sets? So for some reason, it's this parent process that stands out on this host, but it's this host stands out over here. Well, now we have 2 things from 2 different reports for the same hunt. Now you've really refined your insights on the hunt, because you basically hunted for the same behavior 4 different ways. And based on the intersections of those data, now you can say, well, I almost can make this an alert. But the problem is it's not the same process you'd go through with a standard SOC alert, right? Where you have like the one-to-one event. You're actually doing data analysis, kind of like a hunter would do based on multiple reports for the same behavior. And I think that would be a really cool approach if it can mature to something like that. Because the nice thing about creating buckets is the data is still there for you to manually look at, but there's nothing wrong with accelerating the visibility to things that stand out on their own, right? That would be more detection or higher fidelity. And so I think that's where automation needs to take threat hunting is, how do we separate here's some quick wins, and here's some, we need to really dig into the data and provide some of our expertise and stuff before we start throwing things over the fence. And I think so, like I said, it's more of an enhancement. It doesn't really solve the problem, but I think that's how people should be looking at automation, specifically around threat hunting.
Awesome. That's very insightful. Yeah, I feel like the threat hunt library, as we call it, would be the starting point for a lot of that, right?
Yeah. And that's something too. One of the things I've wanted to do is help create, when we talk about those different data SKUs, every tool is a little different. So how you might create that visibility or SKU may look different, or maybe the capabilities aren't the same across the board, across tool sets. But being able to create an easy way to say, all right, we have basically 2 parts to the hunt that we can share out. We've got the actual hunt for here's the telemetry you're trying to pull back. And then here's the special way you want to organize the data, which is the aggregation, and make both those 2 things separate so you can kind of plug and play different things to facilitate that much easier too. So it's not, everyone starting from square one all the time. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Like really insightful. Thank you so much, Scott, for speaking with us and walking us through threat hunting, talking
Absolutely.
pretty nice topics on, especially on automation, as well as how you can hunt for TTPs associated with BlackSuit. Really, really enjoyed speaking with you. And I'm sure all our listeners will also love this session as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.